Hi, and welcome to another Nourishing Conversation. I'm happy to be here today again with my friend and colleague, Dr. Blossom Bidding. Blossom is a naturopathic doctor and has a family naturopathic practice in Moncton, New Brunswick. Thanks, Blossom, for joining me again today.
My pleasure.
So today we're talking about vitamins and in particular fat-soluble vitamins. So I think it's really important to clarify the difference and the differences of fat-soluble vitamins in terms of when we're talking about micronutrients. So where do you want to start? Tell us about, what makes fat-soluble vitamins special.
I think we started coming up with this concept when we spoke last time. We were talking a bit about the immune system and ways to help in general with your own innate and acquired immunity. And I think we talked a lot about the sunshine and vitamin D and how our bodies can make vitamin D from sunshine at certain times of the year at our latitude. So fat-soluble vitamins are the vitamins that are absorbed with fat in our body, and they are stored with fat as well. So they don't dissolve or go into solution in water. They are soluble or go into solution with fat. So an important point there is that our body requires bile, the juices from the gallbladder, which come from the liver, to absorb these vitamins. And so if it's not being made by exposure to the sun or injected, then our digestive processes have to be strong. Not only do we have to eat these fat-soluble vitamins in our foods, but also our digestive processes have to be strong in order to be able to absorb the fat. And low-grade fat malabsorption is something that I think we see more of in a subclinical level as naturopaths, or recognize at a subclinical level as naturopaths quite often. And not to get too graphic, but you know that we love to talk about poop. If you're having a bowel movement and you're seeing fat floating on the surface of the water, or the BM is really hard to wipe, those can be signs that a lot of the fat in your diet isn't being absorbed. It's going right through. And then, kind of to back up from that, or go a little further along, it could mean that you're not getting all those fat-soluble nutrients from your foods. I think another important point to bring up when we're talking about fat solubles, and I'll get into the specifics of them, is that some are readily available in the plant world, whereas others really almost require some animal product ingestion or supplementation to make up for that, or really, really concentrating on getting it from certain foods. So unlike the water solubles that are much more, prevalent in all of those colorful, bright fruits and vegetables, some of the fat solubles are a little bit harder to find in concentrated form in the plant world.
Mm-hmm. And then there's the concern, whether it be theoretical or, relevant, of toxicity, right? So water-soluble vitamins, we're going to get rid of through our urine and through some bowel movements, what we don't need. But with fat-soluble, as you mentioned, we can store them. So do you see that as a clinical concern in terms of dietary consumption, that someone could actually eat too much of something and consume too much of a fat-soluble vitamin and then actually store it to the point where it becomes toxic?
I did read a report of an individual eating too much whale liver at one point and becoming vitamin A toxic. So theoretically, if you really, really ate a lot of liver, and I don't want to give a certain amount, but I think the flavor of liver has a natural deterrent of it being the mainstay of our diet day after day after day. Right. Dietary, again, it would be very hard to become toxic in the fat-soluble vitamins if you were just doing dietary. But then if you were supplementing too much, I think theoretically you could get up into toxicity levels, especially if a bottle was left open on a counter and a child or pet got into it. Now that would be more the concern. The more we learn about the fat soluble vitamins, and this is recent research, the more we're discovering that they may not be as toxic to us as we once thought, and that we have tolerance for much higher levels than at one time we thought were lethal or toxic. So I still think that there does have to be a degree of caution, especially with supplementation. I think we're talking about two different things when we talk about supplementation or diet. Unless you're a seal or whale hunter, I don't think that you really have to worry about too much dietary fat soluble.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I do think that even when we first started practice, there was more of a concern around really minimizing the dosing of fat soluble nutrients for that reason. But we've learned so much since that time, and I do think that for a variety of different reasons, some people need more from a supplemental perspective. And, again, some of that comes down to genetics and absorption. So if you're not absorbing it from your food, you may also need to supplement at higher doses in order to absorb it from a supplement as well. So there's a variety of different reasons why someone might benefit from higher doses of a certain fat soluble nutrient and require supplementation and maybe not be able to obtain it from food alone.
Right. Or food and or the sunshine when it comes to vitamin D. Where we live in Eastern Canada, we just don't have enough direct sunlight throughout the year to really keep our stores high. And I've seen hundreds of vitamin D tests, blood tests, and I don't think I have ever seen it that it divides into like low, desirable, and undesirable too high amounts. And I've never seen a number in the too high. I have seen in the sufficient or desirable a couple of times, but most of the tests that I'm seeing, even for people, like I always say, well, if you go down south and you don't do a lot of sunscreen and you're there for a week, you should be able to top up your winter stores. But really, when I see blood tests, that isn't always the case. Like, people need, I think, to really concentrate on some of these nutrients in a dense dietary way or supplementation to make sure that we're getting enough. And I do think that Canadians used to eat a lot more. Let's use the example of liver, seal liver, whale liver, than they do now. And it's interesting that cod liver oil was such a craze in the 50s, I think, in the Maritimes and Newfoundland. Oftentimes it was given at school to prevent nutrient deficiency, to prevent rickets, so, to prevent bone malformation. But now we know that it has a lot of really good immune properties, and it was probably helping prevent the spread of influenza and tuberculosis and certain cancers, MS, because the cod liver oil, I can go on a cod liver oil rant, but it's high in 3 of the fat soluble vitamins. So it's high in a natural source. A lot of the cod liver oils are fortified with vitamin A, like a synthetic vitamin A, but it is a natural source of vitamin A, D, and E. So it's like a really good fat soluble vitamin supplement. And I'm gonna, full disclosure, admit that I can't get it into my kids.
Yeah. That's for sure.
So I do prescribe it a lot in practice, but instead my kids get, tiny little capsules of A, which they chew, and D drops. And eventually I'm hoping that they'll take the cod liver oil, but it is, even the flavored versions are a little bit nasty. So there is that to, I think, consider when it comes to cod liver oil supplementation.
For sure. Yeah, and something else that I just want to mention to the audience as well is that when we're talking about, food sources and kind of like sufficiency, so just enough to prevent rickets is a very different amount than what's necessary to promote optimal health and have some, disease prevention in terms of cancer and flu and those kinds of immune related things. So, I think that there's a big spectrum there between preventing a deficiency and actually optimizing your levels.
Yeah, I totally agree. And when you look at, or when I studied nutrition, at the university undergrad level, we talked about vitamins. It was all about just enough to prevent those deficiency diseases. So if we talk about vitamin D, it's like, it was looked at something to have enough of, to be sure that you don't get, bone malformation. And now we know that having enough of it is important for prevention of disease and supporting our immune system, and, optimizing levels of any vitamins, I think, is a big part of eating whole foods. And, like the whole lip to tail movement of going back to a more traditional way of eating, whether you want to call it Whole30 or paleo or just a whole foods diet, is really, making sure that you're not cutting out. I think in the 80s, cutting fat was the biggest dietary trend. I think maybe the discovery of all the great benefits of omega-3s helped to pull us away from the extreme low-fat diets. And now we're understanding that all of those fats and the fat-soluble vitamins are important. A list of fat-soluble vitamins are vitamin A, D, E, and K. And A is formed in that, more active retinol form in animal foods. We think of retinol, a lot of us have heard of that in terms of beauty products. So it is an anti-aging, anti-wrinkle additive to a lot of topical facial products. But so those foods are highest in liver, tuna fish, eggs, whole dairy products. So if you're going for dairy products for the fat soluble vitamins, you definitely don't want to choose the low fat dairy. So whole fat or mid fat dairy. And then the interesting thing about vitamin A in foods is that the precursor, the preform, beta carotene, are in the plant families. So all those really orangey, yellow fleshed sweet potato, winter squash, carrots. We always think of carrots for vitamin A, which are an excellent source. And an interesting approach to getting vitamin A through diet is that you don't have to worry about all those beta carotenes being too much. You can supplement with vitamin A and then eat as much beta carotene as you want, or the other carotenoids. But I think a combination of the full retinol form in some manner and the beta carotene is a good way to make sure you're getting the full spectrum. Vitamin D, we mentioned sunshine. That's not a food, but it's like what everyone thinks of for getting vitamin D. And there is also vitamin D in mushrooms, so vegetarian or vegan source. You would have to combine the sunshine with the mushrooms for sure to get enough. And then fish and eggs are also good sources. Vitamin E and vitamin K we don't think of as much in terms of immunity, but they both also have really, really important whole systems actions. And vitamin E is such a great antioxidant. It does have this ability to keep I guess our lining levels of immunity strong by just being a great antioxidant. So keeping the inner lining of our nose and digestive system free of damage or premature aging. So vitamin E is readily available in lots of vegetarian foods like plant foods, so walnuts, sunflower seeds, wheat germ, corn, avocado, olives. So that's one thing that I was thinking, well, if someone's wheat-free or gluten-free and they're avoiding corn because of the inflammatory diets or the anti-inflammatory diets or low grain diets, then really making sure that they're getting the walnuts or the sunflower seeds and the olive oil to make up for that full spectrum of intake. Vitamin E is also in those deep chlorophyll rich foods, so those deep greens like kale and collard and romaine and broccoli. Broccoli's our favorite in this house. Can't go wrong with broccoli. And vitamin K, moving along the list, again, liver is the best source of the. So with vitamin K, there's two forms, and one form is in more animal presence, but it's in micro animal presence too. So it's the bacteria in our gut forms vitamin K2, and fermented foods. So like sauerkraut or miso, kombucha would all have this naturally occurring vitamin K2 because those microorganisms produce it. And then K1 is again in those deep leafy greens, olive and soy oil.
Yeah, I love to like pick out the themes, right? And I see
Yeah,
a
yeah.
lot that is, we're talking about a certain group of vitamins, the fat soluble vitamins, but there's still like a theme, a thread that kind of
Right.
comes. And so, like you said, it's a wide variety of different colors of plant foods and good quality animal foods if you eat animal food, so opting for the higher fat versions, good quality eggs. Like there's really that nice fish if you can get it, nuts and seeds if you're vegetarian. So as long as you're getting like a good diversity of foods, you should be somewhat optimal in most of those vitamins theoretically.
Or at least not deficient, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, and I mean, yes, if you're eating a lot, and I start a lot of my patients off on, saying, well, do you eat 3 handfuls of leafy greens a day? And most of the time it's like, okay, well, I want you to do that, and then eventually I want you to be eating 3 handfuls of leafy greens 3 times a day.
Right.
So I think for the power habit that we could tie in here is to start to train your mind a little bit to look for those leafy greens with a nice cold pressed plant-based oil at most meals. So that might be, breakfast time, sauteing your eggs if you eat them with some broccoli or spinach, and then adding a little olive oil on top. Or lunchtime could be a sunflower seed on greens salad with some oil of your choice. And supper time, I like to roast or steam. So that's how I usually recommend that you get all those greens in. But the power habit that I would suggest is just look for dark greens, and see that they're part of your plate at most meals.
Yeah.
Not every meal. I'm realistic. But if it's not dark green, maybe it can be bright orange. Yeah. And maybe it is just, zesting a clementine.
Right.
So, yeah.
And then what do you have any strategies, or should we really be concerned if there are some digestive issues? Maybe it's something as extreme as a diagnosed inflammatory bowel condition, or maybe it's just it's an indigestion, particularly with a higher fat meal. Do you recommend digestive enzymes? Are you supportive of bitters? And tell us a little bit about your approach to that.
So those are the cases with a condition like inflammatory bowel disease. I think that someone should be tested for their fat soluble vitamins and have a look at, it may be 4 years of low grade disease before a diagnosis even comes along. And so they could be quite deficient in those fat soluble vitamins. But circling back to your questions, I really love bitters. I'm a herb hugger, and digestive bitters are, anything from adding a little parsley or dandelion leaf or arugula to your salad to taking a concentrated combination of bitter herbs, can really get that bile flowing from the liver at the right time. And the right time is when fats are going through. And helping to sequester that fat and the fat soluble vitamins from the food and bring it into our digestive tract. So I usually recommend starting kind of slow and low with the bitters. You can put like a dropper full into half a glass of water as you're eating, or within 15 minutes of starting the meal or before the meal. And then as the taste kind of grows on you, most people say that they really enjoy it. They like the not being as bloated, not being as gassy, are kind of the direct things that people notice. And then over time, increasing that to like a half a teaspoon to a teaspoon per meal, depending on the size of the person and their needs. And I was actually collecting some bitters this morning, or AKA weeding my herb garden. This time of year, the dandelions are springing up, and their roots are one of the most bitter herbs out there. So the leaves and roots of dandelions are a great bitter to start off with, and chopping up one leaf in a full meal-sized salad would be one way just to introduce your palate to a gentle bitter.
Yeah, because we've really gotten away from that, right? And that's, I think, one of the many powers that are contained in herbs and green leafies, is that they do have that bitterness to them and help to stimulate digestion, right from the get-go. So along with all of their micronutrients and other benefits.
Yeah. So tying into current times and thinking about food sustainability and self-sufficiency, I'm also starting to sprout in the house, and some of those sprouts are really sweet. Whereas, if you get some radish or mustard or arugula, you're getting a whole kind of plethora of the taste, the sweet, the pungent, the bitter. So that's another way to just kind of experiment with bitter and taste, is getting those leafy green sprouts going too.
Yeah, wonderful. Yeah. Lots of great power habit tips in there. That's great. Thank you so much, Dr. Bidding. I always appreciate our conversations, and I love that you're willing to share with everything else that's going on. Still making the time for this is really appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you.